So much of the context of anti-apartheid politics and also pro-democracy movements in southern Africa is connected to the greater Indian Ocean sphere that I do want to spend a little bit of time providing you better context on the nature of the Cold War in South Asia over the course of the next couple exercises. So when we say Cold War in Southeast Asia, this includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which was formerly East Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim, which became part of India after 1975, as well as Sri Lanka, which was formerly Ceylon, and the Maldives. Maldives actually connects to Eastern African trade zones as well, and Southern African trade zones. There is also an overlapping region here of a similar Theravada zone, the religion of Theravada Buddhism being quite predominant in Burma, and also Thailand and Cambodia and Laos, but also connected to Sri Lanka and parts of southern India. So then the sort of Theravada zone is kind of overlapping, connecting South to Southeast Asia as well. Well, you have this trade zone of the Indian Ocean that connects East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. War period in South Asia, you have a Sino-India border war from 1962, which results in tensions between the PRC and India's Democratic Socialist Republic basically through the present, although the Democratic Socialist element of the Indian Republic gets co-opted, and basically the modern state of India is a right-wing republic. Okay. Now, the legacy of Nehru and Gandhi, Jinnah, Bhutto, and others through South Asia was located in the geocenter of non-aligned politics. Consequentially, during the Cold War, politics are initially neglected in South Asia, and there's this sort of non-aligned movement which becomes predominant. But there's pressure put on South Asian states by the United States, especially to, quote, pick a side, as it were. Nehru, however, does visit the United States in 1949, but there's not so much impact. While the Marshall Plan places an emphasis on co-opting Latin American economies for the sake of rebuilding Europe and repressing, therefore, Latin American democracies for the sake of keeping those economies in check to be drawn upon to rebuild Europe, U.S. involvement in the Pacific places an emphasis on Southeast Asia in a similar light for the sake of rebuilding the Pacific, especially the Philippines, Japan to a certain extent, and South Asia is not so much focused upon. This being said, you do have South Asia emerging as an emphasis throughout the sort of broader period. It doesn't help Nehru's case, in the case of his relationship with the United States, that he offers a brutally honest assessment of President Truman as a mediocre politician, and an assessment that sours Truman's views of Nehru moving forward. So part of the problem is that maybe the U.S. desires to view itself as one of the two, or one of the world's largest democracies, or two largest democracies, but India has consistently been 3 times the population of the United States. India is the world's largest multi-party representative democracy throughout the entirety of the 20th century, before the BJP de facto clamps down on the country, transforming it into a much different state today. But during the Cold War, it's a multi-party democracy. And also, problematically for U.S. rhetoric, a democratic socialist state. Paul Hoffman, who's one of the founding members of the Ford Foundation, shifted U.S. policy towards India during the course of the Cold War and believed that the Cold War, at least the balance of the power in the world, could depend on U.S.-Indian relations. Chester Bowles, the American ambassador in Delhi, is pictured here signing the first deal with Nehru in 1952. Liaquat Ali Khan of Pakistan also established patron-client relations with the United States, giving the U.S. critical air position and proximity to Iran and Central Asia, essentially regulating India to a negligible status geopolitically for U.S. concerns. Thus, U.S.-Pakistani relations were not really about Cold War politics in the strictest sense, although the Cold War was a factor. Another factor overall geopolitically was the balance of South Asia as a region. The Kashmiri border conflict between India and Pakistan was a problem throughout the period in question. India and Pakistan had fought wars, or 3 wars, over Kashmir. This included the India-Pakistani Wars of 1947 and 1965, as well as the Kargil War of 1999 and later border conflicts and spouts. The two countries have also generally been involved with several skirmishes over the Siachen Glacier over the course of the period in question as well. Now, an aside for you while you're doing this reading of the Cold War in South Asia, if you read the Cold War in South Asia, there's a little bit of a mention very frequently of the Battle of Hearts and Minds, which is actually a question that Johnson introduces during the course of the Vietnam War during the Johnson administration in the 1960s. So actually, I would argue it's not so applicable to Cold War South Asia, but it's useful to have the context nonetheless. By the time we get to Cold War South Asia from 1953 to 1956, there are important shifts that have occurred. First, remember that Eisenhower, sort of a Cold War hawk or staunch Cold War advocate, is out. Stalin is out. 1955, Pakistan is a member of the Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO, and Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Neither a member state of the Middle East or Southeast Asia, however, but a key fueling point for U.S. Air Force pilots in between the two regions. And Pakistan receives $170 million in U.S. military aid and foreign direct assistance. The relationship attracted attention from the Soviet Union. Malenkov and Khrushchev view the Third World as a potential opportunity, and in 1953, Soviet aid begins to enter the Democratic Socialist Republic of India via the United Nations expanded program of technical assistance. This is the first non-communist aid program of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is transforming its stance as early as the 1950s to support even movements and pro-democracy organizations that are not communist. The first direct Soviet aid to Afghanistan was in 1954 through a development loan. Aid also flowed into India as of 1955 for a steel plant in Bhilai, which is actually pictured here in the background. During the same period, Nehru visited Moscow, and Khrushchev follows with visits to Afghanistan, India, and Burma. So, what is this view of India? Well, Khrushchev's vision, Bombay was difficult from a sanitary point of view, but tellingly not from a political one. So he's seeing the non-aligned movement as a potential ally. After the period of initial Soviet visits, you see a shift in South Asia from 1956 to 1962, with greater attempts for the Americans to make an influence in the region. Chester Bowes, Max Millikan, and Walt Rastow, MIT liberal economists, the latter of the two, and the U.S. ambassador, of course, the former, see India as a critical test case for American developmental programs under the American adoption of developmentalism and also development ideas. Burton Kaufman characterized this shift as trade, not aid, to trade and aid. So first we're seeing trade and not foreign direct aid or foreign direct investment, but then you see a shift to trade and foreign direct aid. Of course, given the evidence that we have discussed in the course thus far, we might say that it was a shift toward trade and loans or extortionary lending policies in the name of development. During this period, the Indian National Congress politicians attempted to mediate, holding a stance of courting both Soviet and American aid as a demonstration of non-aligned movement political stances. The India Statistical Institute of Calcutta, with the director Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, who is pictured here develop key economic research policy, and become the greatest influence in South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean in terms of the economic policy at play, so influencing East Africa as well. Economic policy was generally more centralized than Milton Friedman was comfortable with, but Ford and Rockefeller were not opposed to these developments so long as there was an emphasis on industrialization, and indeed, under Director Prasantra Chandra Mahalanobis, there was an emphasis on industrialization in the entire Indian Ocean zone. Nonetheless, there were a series of poor harvests, insufficient exports, and shortages of industrial goods, which led to a foreign exchange crisis in 1957 and 1958 throughout the region, attracting global attention. Max Millikan commented on the situation by noting, "I cannot escape the conclusion that the shape which development planning in India takes over the next few months may be as critical a determinant of world history over the next decade as any other single factor." Khrushchev chimed in, "Let the friendship between our countries be as strong as metal from the Belai metallurgical complex," he said in 1959, before visiting Burma, Indonesia, and Afghanistan. Between 1959 and 1979, over the course of the next 20 years, the Soviet Union organized 270 development projects in industry and infrastructure in Afghanistan alone. Khrushchev to Kennedy in Vienna in 1961 reportedly has said, "In India, the Communist Party does not have Nehru's support, but nevertheless, we provide aid to India." This was broadly understood as a rib at Kennedy's policy, where Kennedy would only provide aid to anti-communist powers and anti-communist governments, leading Kennedy to support several anti-democratic governments in Latin America. Nasser also responded to the circumstance with a quote. Nasser said, quote, "This puts commenting on Nasser, Khrushchev also responded, rather. So we're shifting the emphasis here. Nasser in Egypt, but Khrushchev is saying Nasser puts all the communists in prison, but even while receiving substantial Soviet aid. So the Soviets are sort of ribbing Kennedy during the period in question, saying we provide aid to everyone. At the same time, you have the famous incident of the U-2 spy plane, which was shot down over Soviet airspace, and Pakistan's bases of U.S. air operations became widely known, while PM Muhammad Ayub Khan hosted the first Soviet aid project in Pakistan in 1961, making the Americans look very widely into the region, and members of regional governments across the Indian Ocean looking at the Americans as just being broadly construed as hypocrites. From 1962 onward, you have dramatic shifts, nonetheless, in South Asia's politics. As of 1961, Nehru positions troops on the border of the People's Republic of China and instigates accidentally the October 1962 border war, a brief and devastating defeat for the Indian Army and for Nehru as well. In 1962, you also have in the background there, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and hence, in the case of looking towards South Asia, there's another gain for American geopolitics in the case of PRC defeat of India. Why? It provides an argument for increased U.S. military aid in the region, and arms shipments to Pakistan quadruple between 1960 and 1963, while the U.S. begins to provide aid to India as well, sparking a frequently looked over arms race between Pakistan and India, with the United States providing aid to both sides of this mini arms race, which becomes a macro arms race very quickly. In the early 1960s, India asked the Kennedy administration for funds that were unlinked to projects in order to finance imports, so-called free money, from the perspective of critics. But instead, the Cold War heated up, aid became increasingly linked to outcomes, and was subject to narrower US-imposed conditions, such as on family planning, food aid, and reduced Indian criticism of the Second Indochina War, also known as the American War or the Vietnam War, depending on the side that people were on. In other words, project aid, initially meant to develop the Indian economy, gradually evolved into program aid, whose express purpose was to shape Indian policy. The changing nature of U.S. assistance to India increased donor leverage and therefore presented new challenges to Indian policy-making communities. Among other consequences, it helped ensure that very little technological transfer took place. Nonetheless, you also have in 1965 two U.S.-supplied armies having active skirmishes between Pakistan and India. And then in 1974, from the perspective of the Indian government, quote, peaceful nuclear explosion tests and an arms race in India heats up again. The development of the Indian nuclear weapons program and the Pakistani subsequent nuclear weapons program becomes one of the greatest threats to global security, despite the fact that the United States supports both sides with aid throughout the development of the programs, and even up through the present has remained completely uncritical of both countries having nuclear weapons, despite the tensions between the two. This is an enormous threat, of course, to global security, especially as the Agni 5 rocket from India can hit half the globe. So, quite substantial. Nonetheless, the position of Indian politics has been one that states that it's in favor of global peace, and therefore, drawing upon the tradition of the non-aligned movement, this has been a position that influences East African politics as well.